at noon. So we will get started here shortly. Let a few other folks join us. Just as a reminder, if you are joining us, please be sure to log in with your name. And if you could go in the chat box and indicate where you're listening in from. And if there are others with you, please indicate the number of people listening in. This is a great way for us to measure how successful these webinars are. So we'll get started here in just a moment. Along with me, today is Blair Chambers with NCDOT, the Public Transportation Division. Together, NCDOT and NCPTA bring these webinars to you every couple of months. And this is number 4 in the series of webinars. We've covered topics such as transit planning, how to better understand ridership and increase ridership. We've talked about microtransit up in the Midwest part of the country and some successes that they're having there today. And then for today, we are going to be talking about TNCs, or transportation network companies. TNCs, one example would be Uber, and I'm sure we'll be talking about those types of services. But this is one of the sort of disruptive technologies that are on our minds here in the public transportation industry. So this is a very timely webinar for us to be talking about this, and I think you'll probably hear a little bit about some successes in working with TNCs and some of the challenges. I know most recently I have in front of me 2 articles, one that speaks very favorably about how TNCs and transits are working together and how we can solve some first mile, last mile initiatives. Then there's recently been some chatter across the internet waves about Uber's public offering and how they are talking about taking over public transportation as a way to woo some stockholders into that public offering. So as with many different things, the future is out there. It's hard for us to understand what it might happen to be, but we certainly appreciate our speakers today shedding some light on this issue. We have with us Sharon Fagan. She is the Executive Director with the Shared Use Mobility Center, and we welcome Sharon to the webinar and to speaking to us here in North Carolina. Then we have 2 systems joining us that have worked with TNCs. Olaf Kennard, who is the Director of Marketing, Communications, and Technology with CATS, and Mary Kate Morrigan, who is the Transit Service Planner with Go Triangle and Go Durham. So in just a moment, Blair is going to switch over and we will start into the webinar. Again, please make sure that you go into the chat bar and indicate where you're viewing the webinar from. And if you have other people in the room, put a little 2 or 3. This helps us with understanding the success and the interest in our webinars. There's also a survey that was sent as part of the webinar invitation link. Please take that survey, and if you have any suggestions about future webinars, please let either myself or Blair know, and then we will handle some questions at the very end. We will, if you could put those questions again in the chat bar, and we will manage those when we get towards the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon, and we will get started.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to make sure, can everybody hear me? Is this working?
I can hear you, Sharon.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be here with all of you and talk about shared use mobility and partnerships between transit agencies and TNCs and kind of the latest in what's going on in this topic area. So, okay, so I'm gonna tell you to start with a little bit about the Shared Use Mobility Center, who we are, what we do, and then talk about what is shared mobility, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, know, but just some of what's happening in the field today. And then some of what we've been learning from the many pilot projects we've been involved in, and some of the considerations in terms of partnerships and some of the potential challenges. And then I will talk about some resources we have available as well to help you as you go forward in this exciting time with many modes of transportation. So the Shared Use Mobility Center, to start with, we are a young organization. We've been around about 5 years, and our growth has kind of paralleled the industry. We started, we're a nonprofit. We work in the public interest, and our mission is really to work with cities, communities, regions to create multimodal transportation systems that work for all. And we're interested in systems that are connected, that are equitable, that are environmental, and giving people a lot of choices and options. And so our work does involve a lot of implementation. We're working in over 25 cities around the country on pilot projects that include transit agencies with a variety of different shared mobility operators. And we work in particular with the Federal Transit Administration, and then in California, we work with the Air Resources Board, and many of our pilots come out of those two categories, and I will talk a little more about them in a couple minutes. The other thing that we do is we do a lot of research, applied research, really looking at what are the impacts from these different modes and how might it affect the operations of transit, and really more fundamentally, how does it impact mobility for our communities, and is it increasing options, or is it detracting from what we already have? And so what does this look like? And we also operate a clearinghouse of information, our learning center, and I'll show you some slides about that at the end of the presentation. But just so you know, there is a learning center where we're putting all the case studies, all the RFPs, all the RFIs, and trying to maintain this information to make available for your use. We do a lot of convening as well, workshops, and an annual summit here in Chicago. So the Mobility on Demand Sandbox is a project that has been around through the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, for the last almost 2 years. There are 12 cities that got started with this, and they have partnerships that include first last mile connections, multimodal apps and payment integration, carpooling, ride sharing, demand response and paratransit, various incentive strategies to get people to use these services, and then expanding services in general. So we've been working with all of these projects and created a learning group where the projects could communicate with each other about best practices. At this point, nearly 2 years in, there are 11 of the 12 projects operating. Some of them just got started. And I would say one of the sort of learnings right from the get-go was that it doesn't all happen immediately. It takes time to build the relationships, to bring communities together around some of these. Some of them got off the ground, almost immediately, but a lot of them, it took a while. The other thing I want to mention about the Mobility on Demand Sandbox is that the FTA is just about ready to announce a new program. What my understanding is that announcement could come in the next week or two. And there will be another round of funding for these types of projects with some refinements, you know, based on the experience so far. And this is just to show you some of the companies that have been involved with the Mobility on Demand projects. So the other big area where we work is in California with the Air Resources Board. And these projects are very specifically oriented toward disadvantaged communities. And there are also areas where there is a lot of pollution, and there's an interest in electrification and reducing emissions, at the same time providing more mobility to disadvantaged communities. So we just got started with the Clean Mobility Options Program, where we're administering a fund that will be providing resources to low-income communities, particularly rural communities and smaller communities that are looking at using some of these modes to expand options. We have worked closely in Los Angeles with a all-electric car sharing program that is now expanding to be multimodal. And we look a lot at fast charging and creating electric infrastructure for these programs. And we have been involved in with the TNCs and shuttles in rural California, taking farm workers to jobs and to medical appointments. So a lot of learning from all of those projects. And what we see overall, as I think you all know, that shared mobility is growing, and it's growing fast. So we're talking today about TNCs, which are primarily Uber, Lyft, Via often fits into that category. And then there are some other companies, smaller providers. Some are local, some have actually been started by transit agencies, but primarily Uber and Lyft really dominate that area. Other companies in shared mobility, you can see on this map that you know, there are microtransit, which sounds like you had a webinar about, a lot of different kinds of car sharing, a lot of bike sharing. Now we have scooter sharing, and just, you know, a set of modes, and they're coming up. And the thing that we're noticing most is that these companies are starting to consolidate, and they're becoming multimodal themselves. So as was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, you know, this question, is Uber looking to take over this whole arena? They now, and Lyft also, they both have electric bike share, they have investments in scooter sharing, they are putting transit onto their apps in some cities. And so they are starting to have offerings that are very multimodal. And so it does raise a lot of questions about, you know, what is the impact of that on our existing transit services? Is that a help to it, or is that going to take away from it? And, you know, will all communities still be served? Will it still be cost effective? And we all know that, you know, a small vehicle cannot carry the same passenger load as a bus or a train. So there's a lot of dynamic change occurring in this industry. In addition, there are many new modes emerging. This is just, you know, in 2017, suddenly we had the dockless bikes. Before that, all the bike share was docked. Then all of a sudden, scooters appeared. Another thing that's become much more popular of late is carpooling, electronically based carpooling. Of course, there's been carpooling for years, but it's never really had the kind of uptake that I think many of us hope for. But with Waze and some of these larger companies getting into it, there are very interesting opportunities, especially for employers in utilizing carpooling to get people to jobs, and jobs that are not located centrally where transit might be easier to use. And now we're seeing these little vehicles also emerging, and it's kind of scooter sharing where you're sitting on the scooter, maybe it's covered to protect you from the rain. So this is happening in some cities this year. So why is all this happening? It's really because there's a lot of innovation, there are a lot of challenges, and you know, there are gaps in service. And what the TNCs have done really well is they have been able to provide on-demand service and take people from places at 24/7, you know, where there was not transit service. So and do it quite efficiently. So there's a lot to learn from these services and to incorporate into our own public transit services, into your, you know, our agencies, but it's also the partnerships that can provide those first last mile connections. The other thing is it can be implemented quickly. It's been very attractive because of lower capital costs, and perhaps with some of the active transportation, with the bike share, the scooter share, it's also encouraging a healthy, walkable community. So again, increased accessibility is a particularly strong attraction of these services. So what we're learning from our research is quite interesting from looking at transit and mobility research. And I'm not going to go into all the modes, but I wanted to touch briefly on the TNCs in particular. And in 2016, we did the first study in conjunction with APTA. We looked at 7 cities across the US and tried to assess, based on data we were able to get from Uber and also surveys, and we looked at what was the impact. And what we found at that time, now this is a few years ago, there was not a clear relationship between the level of rush hour TNC use and longer term changes in public transit. We found that TNC use was taking place in communities at all income levels, and most of the trips were short. They were concentrated in downtown neighborhoods, and they went to and from the airports. They were on average, you know, around 3 miles, and that that there was, you know, a lot of interest in this. So now looking more recently, in fact, looking as recently as last month, this is a study that was just done in Chicago. And this study was possible to do because of the regulations that Chicago has enacted, where it requires data from the TNCs. And part of like the learning that's going on is also limited and expanded by access to data and our ability to understand the trip making that is in fact taking place. So Chicago has been quite forward thinking in its data collection, and so it knows the number of trips in Chicago, and it's a lot, and it's growing fast. And they continue to see that Friday and Saturday nights have the most usage. People do use the TNCs for going out at night, and that it really does fill in a gap that transit service is often not able to fill. At the same time, there is heavy usage that also does go on at rush hour. And we see this usage particularly in sort of more complicated destinations that are, again, these gap areas. And primarily in the heavy usage times, it's very interesting. Shared rides are overall about 18% or a little less than that of all the rides. But when in the city analysis, when it focused in on disadvantaged low-income communities on the west and south sides of Chicago, it found, well, this was a knowledge they had anyway about people spending additional hours each year commuting compared to the average resident in the region, but the disadvantaged communities had longer TNC trips, and they also had a higher rate of shared rides. So 39% on average were shared. And I'm sure this reflects, the cost and the TNCs filling in these gaps. So that's some of our most recent data about how these services are being used. And then, this is just for your consideration, where and how TNCs can help fulfill transportation needs. And clearly, land use is a very important component. And, this transect here goes from the most rural area to, a very dense downtown. And it's just good to think about that there are going to be different purposes in these different regions and because of land use considerations. So what we're learning from the transit and mobility pilots are a lot of different things. There are many of these pilots. When we got started on all this, there were very few, and these FTA ones were kind of it. And now, literally, we're tracking partnerships, and there are hundreds of them happening all over the country. So what we see is that serving areas where transit is hard to run, there are a lot of that TNC pilots that can be on demand. They can cover low density areas. They can take on inefficient routes, and they can also serve late night third shift workers. We see pilots improving accessibility for people with disabilities because often the standard paratransit service 24 hours in advance, even more in advance in some cases, but by utilizing the TNC technology, it can be more flexible, on demand, shorter wait times, and transit agencies have found some potential cost reductions, which mostly happen because they provide a mix of services, some wheelchair accessible and some not. But by providing it both at the same time, they're able to shift a number of people and reduce costs. So that, and what we're also finding is that transit agencies are often utilizing the technology, for example, the technology of Avia or Transit App and some Transloc, some of these companies that have that kind of technology, but bringing it into their own vehicles, their own drivers and services. So there's a mix of these things going on. And then in terms of equity, we find that the pilots can potentially reduce the cost of transportation. Often that's because there's a subsidy provided, but it still adds up to less than the cost of the service if the transit agency was to expand in a low density area. And in terms of equity and access to emerging transportation technologies, what we're seeing is a growth of what I would call concierge services, where there's essentially someone that you can call who will then make a reservation for you, and that can get around lack of smartphones or limited data plans, and then using kiosks or other providers like a 7-Eleven or something that can sell a card that can, give you a prepaid card for access to a variety of these services, that's a way to address some of the disparities between the technology and the communities that perhaps are utilizing the services. So this is a list of just some pilots that are going on. I can't really go through all of this, but Pinellas County is one of in Florida, is an area that has multiple pilots. I think one of the pilots that's been most successful is where they provide TNC coverage to get people to third shift jobs, and they've combined it with transit, so you can use it late at night to get to the job, like an 11 to 7 kind of job, and then use the transit system to go back home. And they sell kind of packages of services, and they've had a lot of use of that. Go Monrovia is a town in California, and they had partnered with TNCs and also with Bike Share, and they created incentives for sharing rides, and really kind of transformed the way their system works. Cap Metro in Austin, Texas has been experimenting with a number of pilots, and they're in the process actually of discontinuing the one with Ride Austin, and they're in the process of expanding their first last mile pilot. But again, a lot of experimentation, finding that TNCs and also other shared mobility, when carefully planned, can enhance the circle of users of the transit system. Dayton, Ohio provides service to and from bus stops in low density neighborhoods. And then it also has kind of a direct connection to the military base, to Wright Pat, because that's not right on the, in the service territory. So Washington State, Pierce Transit is one of our FTA pilots we work with. And again, that's helping people at a local community college, and it's a first last mile, and it's providing service that when students stay for classes, the classes last longer, go later at night than the service that they had, and they're able to now connect people and take them back to a destination where there is service, or to take them home later at night. There are a number of these pilots with for people with disabilities. The Boston MBTA paratransit pilot has received a lot of notoriety because they were able to document the cost savings. KC Freedom on Demand is another project in Kansas City. So these are all, underway. TriMet has a very interesting trip planning app where they're bringing all the services together. And so what we're seeing is this multimodal mobility as a service. TNCs are one piece of that, but to really create a effective system, you want to bring a lot of different modes together, and regions becoming mobility conveners and brokers, and being able to offer a suite of options, and kind of reaching for that moment when all the different revenue streams can kind of come together, so that you can actually offer people packages and promote and incentivize one mode over another mode at different times of day or days of the week. And so some of the considerations with all these partnerships are, what we've seen with these partnerships is that it's very important to try and align the goals between the public and private sectors, because often there are different goals, even in a pilot project. And then we've seen with the mobility startups that there is this constant change or the consolidation of the companies. So sometimes it gets confusing. Who are you partnering with? How do you change the contract midstream? And that's some of what makes these things take a long time. And we've seen that a lot of the challenges, though, are more legal, psychological, cultural. They're not really the technology. They're about aligning goals and getting people to work together and building trust and making sure that the public interest is actually going to be met. Also, that marketing is a critical part of any of these things, because if people don't know about it and if the pilots don't last long enough, people don't have enough information to actually even try it out or find out whether it works for them. We also, there's been a lot of discussion, learning about, the data sharing and the concerns providers have about in a competitive environment. The private providers don't want to share with each other, and often there haven't been data standards, so every project is kind of a one-off agreement. Now this is starting to change. There is the MDS data standard that Los Angeles has adopted. Our communities are looking at as well. So all of this is good for making it easier. And this is just a chart that kind of outlines, from the agency perspective, you're thinking about planning, thinking about the operations, accounting, auditing. But from the provider side, it's important to think about trade secrets, competitiveness, privacy. Is it going to be subject to the public records disclosure? What does that mean for them? So just understanding a little more about each other, we hope makes it easier to work out agreements. Finally, right-of-way considerations. The curbside is critical for all of these programs. Who owns the streets, so to speak? Where do you put the drop-off? Who's using the streets? If you're going to have a multimodal environment, and we need a safe environment, how do you accommodate bikes and scooters and separate bus lanes and TNC pickup and drop off? And at the same time, what happens to the single occupancy vehicle, which is still king in many of our communities. And then shared autonomous vehicles, I just put this in. These are all different kinds of shuttles, and now we're seeing a lot of transit agencies eager to test out autonomous buses. Even so, the technology, again, getting incorporated into a variety of services and thinking about how can, shared services. And so I think a lot of what we learn in these TNC pilots is going to be applicable as the technology evolves. And finally, think about maximizing the person throughput instead of the vehicle throughput. And this is another consideration when we talk about land use, when we talk about the curb space and utilizing it. You can see that if you have just cars, they take up all the space. Autonomous cars, they take up the same amount of space. Obviously, a bus takes up much less. If you put bikes on there, it's going to look more like the bus. So these different services are gonna, you know, we all as taxpayers pay for the roads, and what is the best and highest use in different situations. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, we do have a lot of resources, and we encourage you to look at our Learning Center, and you will find a lot more detail about research and about all these different modes. And we have a lot of case studies on the different pilots that I mentioned. And so we encourage you to take a look at that. And that is it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. What a fantastic overview of this whole topic. We appreciate all the work that the Shared Use Mobility Center does, and you sharing with us. Please stay with us. You do have a few questions, which we will get to at the very end. And we're going to switch over and talk about two examples here in North Carolina. We'll be starting off with Olaf at Katz. Again, if you have a question, you can go ahead and put it in the chat bar, and we will get to them at the end. And while Olaf's presentation is coming up, we do not have a next topic. We were thinking of taking a break for the summer and maybe coming back in September, but please watch your email, and Blair and I will work something out and let you know what that is as soon as we can. I see that we have some images up, so Olaf, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Blair. I assume you can hear me? Blair?
Yes.
Okay. Earlier we had some audio difficulties. I want to make sure you hear. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Katz jumped into this experiment, how it works, why we initially chose Lyft, the results and kind of next steps, and then some pitfalls that we've experienced over the past year. Basically, like a lot of transit systems, back in 2015, 2016, we started looking at this whole TNC and how it affected us, and did it really affect us, and are there opportunities here? And when we looked at it, it really looked like what we just talked about, is that it happens more in the evenings and weekends to areas that we typically don't serve. And commuting day to day in Charlotte via TNC is much more costly than it would be to ride us or to drive their car. About the only thing they would save here locally would be their parking. So from an economic standpoint, we're not really seeing the commute aspect changing. What we are seeing are auxiliary secondary trips on weekends in areas where we don't serve, or where we've reduced our service area. So we started to look at how can we leverage and partner with them. And so we started looking at some areas with our light rail line that we're going to open up in March of 2018, and decided on two areas. And our pilot program, which is still in effect with Lyft, is basically at two different light rail stations along our new 9.9 mile light rail line. And one is in the university area, right next to UNC Charlotte, but we do not cover UNC Charlotte because like many people, the millennials who attend UNC Charlotte would use it in a way that probably would not be beneficial for us in that respect. In addition, we have a light rail line and stop actually on the campus. So we don't need to be taking students to and from UNC Charlotte. What we did do is focus the geo zone, the pickup and delivery area, across I-85 towards the University Research Park area, where we have several Fortune 500 companies spread out through the University Park area. And this was an area that 10, 15 years ago, we had a shuttle service running throughout there, and it was extremely inefficient, costly, was a dog to get around because of traffic, and there was no point-to-point. So you had to go through 3 or 4 or 5 different businesses before you actually got to yours. So And looking at that, we chose this area because we can provide more point-to-point service between the daily commuter that works in the university area and the light rail system. And when we looked at that, the economies of scale were just unbelievable. It typically would cost us $400,000 to $500,000 a year to run a shuttle through that service, maybe picking up 4 to 5 people an hour based upon previous experience in that area. Calculating that out with a TNC, it was totally different. We probably would spend $40,000 a year, service the same customers, and could take those monies and spend it in other areas where we are more competitive in transit trips. So that was kind of the economical reason for it. The other reason was that it also allowed us to do first and last mile in areas that are more economically depressed. So the second area is the Parkwood Station area, and it covers an area that the city's trying to reinvest in and provide opportunity for low income and minorities. And the light rail is basically 2 to 3 miles from that neighborhood and across the Norfolk Southern Railroad track lines and the Amtrak station. So that area serves more opportunities for people to get to and from jobs and to and from educational opportunities. So how it works for us is we have a geofenced area, and we have each of the stations geofenced, and you can go to and from any place within that geofenced area as long as you start or end at the light rail station in the geofenced zone. And if you do, then we will contribute $4 towards that trip. So in addition, a requirement of it is that you purchase a monthly pass through our mobile ticketing app. That is the primary way that most people use it. We do have a secondary way, and that is that there is a promo code at each of the 2 stations that you can enter into your Lyft app, and you can take 2 trips a month. So let me talk a little bit about that, because in talking with the TNCs, the second option is what they like to push, and you will get a lot of riders, but you won't be guaranteed that they actually use transit as part of their trip. So one of our requirements was that we wanted to be able to ensure that we had people who were using transit using it for the first mile, last mile if they're getting the subsidy, not just creating an opportunity in which we could subsidize anybody who walked up to the station and then got a free ride, within the area and never used public transit. So the majority of our trips are from our customers who purchase the mobile app, and they get 40 trips a month in which we will contribute $4 for each trip. And we're doing at the university area roughly around 50 trips a month to and from the area of the employment base, high employment base, the Wells Fargo, the Husqvarnas, the Duke Energy, the TIF-CREF organizations that are up there. So that is working well. We want to increase that. If we had put a shuttle service again, it would have been extremely costly for us to do that. And so we're working with the employers to expand the employee participation from the large employers, and we expect that over the next year we'll probably more than double our ridership in the university area. The kind of reason we chose Lyft was that we did go through and look at several different of the companies, Lyft and Uber, but we found that Lyft was more responsive and more knowledgeable in transit than the other TNCs. In fact, the gentleman that we dealt with, a guy named Paul Davis, actually was a transit planner for the San Diego transit system. So when we got on the phone and we were talking about all the different aspects of how we do things and how transit does things, there was an instant connect. He knew what we was talking about. He knew the issues with paratransit and the need to provide that service and other aspects of transit and scheduling. we just didn't find that skill level and knowledge base when we were talking with the other TNCs. And so for our pilot, that's the reason we chose Lyft. And it's been good for us. We would like to get into the next arena in the sense of what's kind of been talked about is the lack of APIs, the inability to make it seamless to the customer in the sense of the payment structure between us and them. So, for example, in order for a customer to use this service, they have to load down the Lyft app. They also have to load down our app. And in order for a customer to use it, they have to have a credit card with Lyft. That's a requirement of Lyft. It's also a requirement of Uber and the others. So one of the things that can be an obstacle for the unbanked and underbanked customers is they may not have a credit card. They can get a prepaid card, and a lot of them do have those, but it still is an obstacle. In our mobile app, mobile ticketing app, we have the ability to have a cash wallet. So a customer can load in cash and buy transit passes through their account. The ability to transfer those funds from us to Lyft or Uber, for our purposes of transit trips that we subsidize through Lyft and Uber, is an area that we'd like to see move further along. So there's several areas that Lyft and Uber and other TNCs really need to address in the sense of ensuring that the unbanked and underbanked, low income and minorities are able to participate in the digital economy, especially in the fintech area. And I'm hoping that is some areas that they work into, along with the standardized APIs. So for our purposes, our initial results we feel good about. If we'd had a lot of service requests out there, then we would probably put in a shuttle service or another bus route. But given that we're able to provide additional trips for our customers who never would have had those trips before, it's a plus for us, and it's also a cost savings in that respect. We don't anticipate opening this up to every light rail stop. We think that we will be very sparse in doing that. There has to be a market for it as well. So, for example, there's a station that is within a mile of a lot of breweries. Is that a station that would be beneficial for us to do a first mile, last mile with customers? Because there's a lot of activity and trips in that area. But there's some other areas in which there really is not, and we have sufficient bus coverage to those light rail stations to the communities surrounding it that we don't need it. So we're not looking at this as kind of a widespread across a lot of different stations or a lot of different stops, but in certain areas where it truly makes sense that we can partner with it, there's a market for it, and we can expand our services and free up other capital and operating expenses for other services. So that the biggest pitfall that we probably had to go through was just going through the contracting basis of what data you get, the confidentiality of it, and report back. So from a reporting perspective, we don't get exact geographic locations, we get census tract locations. So we get areas in which the customers are in, but not exact areas. And they do that for privacy reasons. I don't see that changing right now with those companies because of the agreements they have with the customers. But it does kind of make it difficult, to get exactly where certain areas are, how close you are to certain businesses or certain work areas. But we get the locations of where they're coming from, our stop, but we only get a census tract in relation to where they went to or came from. So we'd like to have a little more discrete data, but that's something, again, the issues with the TNCs that I think everybody's kind of experiencing with in that respect. So that's kind of our program here. On our website, it has all the information basically I've gone through except for the results that people can go and look at and use. for the first mile, last mile with Lyft. Thank you.
Thank you, Olaf. Some great information that you shared there in terms of what's happening down there with Charlotte and Katz. We're going to transition over to Mary Kate, and while we are doing that, I want to remind everyone that we do record these webinars, and the slides are available. It takes a couple days to process that recording, get the presentation squared away, and get a link up, but you'll get an email from Blair if you attended today, or the whole list, email list for our webinars as to when those are available. So, Mary Kate, you're up.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mary Kate Marukian. I'm a transit service planner with Go Triangle and Go Durham. And today I'm going to talk about our untested, but we hope successful Transit Connect program that will be starting in August. And we're calling this Transit Connect. It's in the RTP area of Durham, the Raleigh-Durham Triangle area, and we'll be partnering with Uber and Lyft. So initially, this program was thought of as a way to be more cost effective with our provision of services within RTP. Go Triangle is a regional transit agency that provides a lot of commuter trips in Wake, Durham, and Orange counties, and our regional transit center is located in RTP. For a long time, we've been providing fixed route shuttle service with our LTVs, or our smaller transit vehicles, throughout RTP, serving the employers like the EPA, IBM, places like that. Our productivity has never been amazing. We had 4 shuttles operating on a fixed route on a schedule, timed to pulse with routes coming into the regional transit center. The ridership, again, wasn't great. It wasn't terrible, but it had seen some wanes in recent years. So we switched to a on-demand but still agency-operated model, partnering with Transloc to set up the platform for our operators to be able to respond on demand to passengers requesting trips from the stops that were previously served by the fixed route shuttles. So the same shuttles, same stops, but on an on-demand basis. We've been doing that for about 1.5 years, and feedback on the program has not been great. Reliability issues, customers aren't in love with it. They don't find it especially usable. We've actually lost ridership since that program started, and costs we didn't save any money. It actually ended up costing us more, because even though you're providing a service on demand, you're still paying an operator to sit in the vehicle or sit in the break room and wait for those trips to be requested. So that's where the real cost of an agency provided service comes in. Whether or not it's on demand, if you're providing it, you're paying for it. So that's when we started creative problem solving, looking at other agencies that have been solving a first last mile issue within an area like this. RTP is a pretty big area. The yellow blob you see on the map, that is, let me close this window so you can see the whole thing. That yellow blob that you see there is the overall service area that we serve. That's actually a little beyond the official bounds of RTP, but that's the entire Go Triangle historical service area. So those routes that you see, or those lines that you see there, those are the routes, are fixed routes that already serve the park. So those are Go Triangle routes, the brown, blue, and green. And then in the north, that is a Go Durham route, that these routes just happen to flow through the park. So we started with those, and we thought, okay, how can we push ridership to the park? People are confident that if they get to the park, they will be able to get to work. Currently we operate the on-demand shuttles at peak hours only. So our new proposal, you could do this at any time of the day. So folks, maybe they don't have a traditional 9 to 5, they can still get to the park and work that shift. Also, with our on-demand shuttles, we were noticing some point-to-point travel. As Olaf mentioned, there's always the issue of how do you know people are using this service to connect with transit. So we had a few stops that were located at apartment complexes within RTP, and we noticed that this was a free pilot, this on-demand agency-operated service. So people were taking this free shuttle from their apartment to their job at IBM. That's a pretty sweet deal. I would do it too, but that's not the way we intended the program to work. So with this new restructure, these points that you see, or the dots, those are connection points that we identified as being safe for pickups with Uber and Lyft, but also on transit routes and not near other uses that would attract that kind of use. So not near a grocery store and an apartment complex, so that folks could just take an Uber to the grocery store and back, not facilitating those kinds of uses. That's not what we intend this program to be. We're hoping that this drives ridership to the park and also improves the ridership of routes coming in, as well as getting around. So we have chosen to partner with both Uber and Lyft for now. We're still finalizing contracts, but feedback we've gotten is it's always good to provide customers a choice. Everybody has their favorite app. As Olaf mentioned, there's pros and cons to working with either organization, restrictions on how they provide their data. We're still in negotiations about how to make sure that this is a good use of our funds. We want to be able to get data out of this as well to present to our board, to our customers. So I think Uber is going to be working with us to provide a heat map. We can't get exact latitude, longitude points of pickup and drop off, but we can get generally where are people going. And we do anticipate the large majority of trips to start from the regional transit center, which you can see on the map is the little green bus. So that's where all our routes come in, and we operate on a pull system. So we do anticipate some peak demand at the regional transit center. So we decided on an up to $10 subsidy per trip. We do want this to feel like a free transfer for customers. We want to encourage people to come to the park, and we want them to not have to worry about surge pricing. And in most of the tests that we've run in office, the trips haven't been that expensive. I think the max I saw was $7.85. So we're not too concerned that it would end up being more than that. And we chose the $10 cap through a planning process that just got completed. The Wake County Transit Plan set a goal for this type of service. What level of subsidy should the agency be aiming to pay per passenger? And for an on-demand type service, that was $10. So if for some reason a passenger has a trip that is more than that, they will pay the difference. Also, tips will be separate. As far as the transit connect points, the connection points, passengers will have to be within 100 feet of those stops. And we did go out and do a test just to make sure that 100 feet away is a safe location, good lighting, good waiting environment, ADA accessible, etc. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing. There we go. So we are partnering with Uber and Lyft. And so with Uber, it's a voucher program. So we will direct customers to go to a link, download a voucher that will go into their Uber account. And as long as their trip follows the rules of the program, which means you have to begin or end your trip at one of these locations that we've identified here. So beyond that, we don't care where you go in the larger yellow area, as long as you begin or end your trip at one of those connection points, you can go anywhere you want. We're not limiting this to any amount of trips per day. We are calling this a pilot so that we can adjust those if necessary. If we're blowing through our budget, which would be a great problem to have, we have the flexibility to, maybe restrict to 2 trips a day, maybe reduce the subsidy, or shrink the bounds of the service area a bit. Right now, we're just trying to drive ridership, drive interest in the program, and see what works for people and where where are the areas that are in high demand. So again, as long as the trip follows the rules of the program and you have that voucher in your Uber account, a $10 subsidy will be applied to your trip automatically. So you'll see kind of a strike through line go through your estimated trip cost, and whatever is left over, which will probably hopefully be zero for the customer, that's what you pay or don't pay. We, Go Triangle, will get a monthly bill paying for those trips, so the customers don't have to worry about that. With Lyft, similar experience, but they will be putting in a promo code in order to get that discounted trip. For Uber and Lyft, there's a concierge dashboard. So for customers that don't have a smartphone, they'll be able to call into our call center, and someone at our agency will book the trip for them. And again, same way as if you're booking it yourself. If it follows the rules of the trip, the discount will be applied. With ADA considerations for transit agency, we're expected to provide the same level of service to our mobile customers and our ADA passengers. So we have riders today that are traveling to RTP on the bus. They're mobility impaired and they are not enrolled in paratransit. They get around just fine on the bus. They have no interest in enrolling in paratransit, but we are changing the service offering within the park from our agency operated shuttles, which all are equipped with lifts, wheelchair lifts, to subsidizing Uber and Lyft trips, which the majority of those vehicles, they're personal cars. Not a lot of people have lifts on their vehicles. So the onus is on us to make sure that those folks have a way to move around the way they've been doing before we change the service offering. So we are working with a third-party private ADA taxi provider, and we'll be paying a higher subsidy. That's still yet to be determined, but a higher per trip subsidy to provide those on-demand trips. Luckily, we were able to find a provider that's located within RTP, so hopefully those response times will be comparable with Uber and Lyft trips. And then as a second option, we are going to give the ADA passengers the option of, if you don't want to book on demand, you can reserve a day in advance with our shuttle drivers. Speaking with our paratransit operators, we wanted to make sure that they had the bandwidth to provide that service. And as long as they have enough notice, they can have an operator assigned to go pick that person up to make that trip. It doesn't necessarily count as a paratransit trip. And as long as we're providing the option for an on-demand trip, as well as giving the option, our bases are covered with FTA. So we're good to go there. So the goals of the program, this is our first last mile connection. Again, we want to increase ridership to the RTP area, make sure that people are able to get around easily. We want this to be a usable service, an attractive service. So increasing ridership overall would be great, especially to the RTP bound routes, and then increasing ridership within the park. And of course, reducing costs would be great. Our budget is roughly half of what it was with our agency provided shuttles, and we're hoping that we'll come in even lower than that. And this is my contact information. I would love to hear from any other agency that's thinking about doing this or is already doing this in some other way, and love to share ideas and brainstorm with you. Feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much, Mary Kate. I can see a TNC session about this time next year where we hear back from you in terms of how your implementation has gone there in the Research Triangle, and then to further hear from Charlotte about how second year has been, but then also maybe to hear from others within the state about how they've been able to use TNC. There are several questions which I'm going to run through here. I think these first two, Sharon, popped up while you were talking, so I think are mostly directed to you. So the first one is, does Chicago have any data on taxi trips taken prior to the TNC explosion, or is there any information on what users did prior to TNCs?
Hi, yes. Chicago has always collected taxi data, and so it did have data. I haven't seen it in a while, but I know that the number of TNC trips so outweighs that what taxis ever did. You know, even though we have, you know, a fairly robust taxi system in Chicago and did before TNCs, it was still a very small portion of the total number of trips that the TNCs now provide. It has, I believe it has gone down some, but it's still, you know, just like maybe, I don't know, 10 times more or something at least. You know, that the TNCs have created a market that the taxis never had. I also know, like, this is dating maybe 2 years ago, I was on a commission that Chicago had where we were looking at the taxi data, and, you know, a big issue for the taxis was in fact going to a lot of disadvantaged communities that, you know, the complaints and the issues were that taxis would never pick people up. So we had a set of different taxi owners and so forth come in and talk to this committee, and what they mostly talked about, or what it seemed like some of the differences were, is that with a TNC ride, you know, you've got the account and the person and the credit card and everything when you head out on your ride. Whereas with a taxi, it's a different story. If someone's not there and you show up a half hour, you know, like the taxi comes a lot longer and maybe the person's already figured out some other option. So the deadheading and the, you know, anyway, different payment structure definitely impacted serviceability. So I think the TNCs have outpaced taxis in terms of serving a broader set of areas. Where the taxis seem to continue to do well is more just being hailed on the street in the densest parts of Chicago, downtown, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. Towards the end of your presentation, you talked a little bit about who owns the road and where people are being dropped off and picked up. This is a little bit related to that, and maybe not focused just as Chicago, but the question is, what's the effect of TNC's growth on the parking infrastructure within downtowns and big private companies? Have you had any of those issues that y'all have looked at?
Well, what we've seen sort of throughout the country in the densest cities is that that parking lot usage is actually going down, and then of course it creates a, you know, it's a reduction in a revenue source. But especially in entertainment areas where people use TNCs a lot, they're using, you know, parking lots less.
Okay. I think Sharon, you addressed this a little bit in your presentation, and Mary Kate, you mentioned it, but Olaf, I don't think I remember you mentioning anything about ADA. So the question is, how are TNCs addressing ADA requirements? So Olaf, could you touch on that just a little bit from your perspective?
Yeah, TNCs typically don't like to address that. At least in our discussions, they really didn't want to get into that. They prefer the transit system to handle it, and either through your existing paratransit or you hire a new one. For us, what we're doing, we're handling it through our existing paratransit service, and kind of dedicating a vehicle in the area so that we can service those customers as needed. We really haven't had that request from that community for ADA type services, but what we kind of surmised was that TNCs at this time really aren't interested in getting into the ADA stuff because of being under the purview of the FTA and all the requirements and issues that may come with that. And a lot of their cars just aren't ADA equipped. So I don't know what others are finding, but that's kind of what we experienced.
I will say that companies like MV Transit, they are doing some work where they partner with Lyft, and I think they might be working with Uber too. I think they have a pilot with Lyft in Dallas, but they, and also the I think Sharon mentioned MBTA Ride. I think MV Transit is working with them there. They basically contract with Lyft to have guaranteed drivers that have Lyft-equipped vehicles to provide on-demand trips. The thing I don't understand is where, if there are any cost savings, they do have to have the operators either staged somewhere ready to go, or they're free to pick up rides while they're waiting for a paratransit trip request. But there is some sort of subsidy for guaranteeing a certain number of drivers through the Lyft app to have those Lyft-equipped vehicles. But I don't know too much about it, but I know MV Transit's doing a little bit with it.
Yeah, I think the market has to have the substantial density to support it. Here in Charlotte, they weren't ready to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, what I've seen is that, you know, the cost savings remains because not everybody who uses paratransit services, in fact, it can even be the majority, require a wheelchair accessible vehicle. Often what people require is a person who can help them, you know, walk from the door or put their walker in the car or whatever, you know, just be an assistant as opposed to the wheelchair accessible vehicle. So what a lot of the cost savings is that you've shifted the majority of your people to this reduced cost service, and then the cost is probably the same as it was for the wheelchair accessible part, but it's just a diminished part of the total service. And the requirements that I've seen are, you know, that you have to have this equivalent service, so you do have to have a way to manage it, but you know, by getting smarter about the numbers and where you position people, you know, there are ways to do it.
Yeah, let me flip ahead a few questions here to something that's a little bit related, and this is the question is, any issues with insurance companies when contracting with the TNC? So kind of backed up to that, particularly for Olaf and Mary Kate, whenever there might happen to be an accident and they're on the TNC part of the trip, it's always easiest to point the finger at the local government than the big company. So let's start with maybe Sharon, if you could quickly just talk about the insurance aspect, and then Olaf chime in.
You know, we're actually having a insurance session coming up. It's next week, in fact, with our FTA projects, because this is a, you know, a topic that's come up. But I think that it really, you know, as cities, states, there's always, you know, umbrella liability insurance. I mean, all the same insurance you carry now, it needs to be in place, and it's part of the contract agreement is to clarify the rights and responsibilities, and you know, there may be requirements that are more significant, but I think that agencies in general have used a lot of outside contractors for services, so it's not that different than that. And I know that a number of the insurance companies are starting to specialize actually in managing these types of services, so they're available to address risk with, whether it's bike share or scooter sharing or TNC.
Yeah.
Olaf, anything else there along with how the city's legal department has looked at this?
Yeah, we're treat kind of like she said, it's like a regular contractor just to a large degree, so they require them to have insurance, which a Lyft and Uber, they clearly have that insurance. So we always know that anytime we have something like that, people will always come for the deep pockets. But Lyft and Uber also now have deep pockets. So you just want to make sure in your contract you spell out that they're required to have a certain level of insurance and they maintain it, and certain levels of driver safety and obeying rules and all those kind of things to kind of protect you from anything they may do, like speeding or running a red light, that you didn't spell out in your contract that they need to follow traffic laws and obey them, and it absolves you of any responsibility if they don't do that. So it's kind of basic, but it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
while you've got the microphone, Mary Kate, if I don't mind jumping on to another question, but Olaf, what's the average cost of the TNC trip in the area that you offer the service?
Our cost is roughly anywhere from the total trip cost is anywhere from $6 to $10. We'll cover $4 of that. No matter if it's $3 or $6, we cover $4. But mainly it's typically over $4. And the way we determine that is you can go on to Lyft and Uber's website and do trips, and it'll give you the average, cost at a certain time of day. So that's how we kind of use their website to model how far we wanted to go, in that respect, and built our financial model kind of off of that and our subsidy from it. So most of our customers, if not all, are paying, anywhere from $1 to $4 or $5 for a trip, depending upon the time of day. So you still have, peak charges coming in when you get at peak periods.
Okay. So Olaf and then Mary Kate, do either of y'all require Uber Pool or Lyft Line as an option versus the individual personal rides?
We don't contract with Uber right now in our pilot, so that wouldn't apply. We did talk to Lyft as we were going through it about the Lyft Line because of I think at that time FTA would help pay some operating costs towards TNC service in which multiple people could be picked up on a single trip, combining trips versus individual point to point. But Lyft at that time in Charlotte wasn't ready to do that. So as we kind of get near the end of our pilot and look forward towards what's next, we'll find more about whether or not any of them are willing to do Lyft Line, because if that money's still available from the FTA, then that's something we like to tap into if we could from operating perspective.
And
Mary Kate, can you? Yeah.
Sure. So we also do not require Uber Pool or the Lyft shared rides either. Both of those services are not offered in the area currently. It's region to region where Uber and Lyft offer the shared ride option or the Uber Pool option. And in addition to that, some of the campuses that we have in RTP have secured campuses. So that was actually a concern that we heard from a few of our area employers, and I feel like that's a pretty specific problem. But EPA, for example, they're a level 4 facility, whatever that means, and having a shared ride from the regional transit center onto their campus would mean not just figuring out a way to get their employee past the gate in the Uber ride, but also getting non-employees onto the secured campus. So there were also some, while we also want to while we always want to get as many single off the road as possible and into transit, there are certain considerations and trade-offs when you're dealing with stakeholders in this type of service. So we probably won't pursue that for RTP unless some of the security, unless we can work out with some of the employers some security procedures, but it would obviously be ideal, but I don't think it's going to work for us.
Mary Kate, while you've got the mic, and then Olaf, what funding sources are y'all leveraging to help pay for the pilot or for your programs?
So we're using our general fund. It's not heavily, there is a little bit of federal funds in there, but that was something that helped make our finance folks a little bit more comfortable. Even though we are following all the FTA rules, not having to report on those trips the way you would if you were just using straight up federal dollars is helpful. But that's a mix of local tax funds and all that.
And we're just using local operating funds because basically all we have in it is marketing and then the subsidy for the trip. So we average, this will also answer another question, we average about 45 to 55 trips at our light rail station and university area. And we're talking less than $5,000 a year to do this. If we can get more up, then it'll increase, but it still would be significantly less than the $400,000 to $500,000 we'd have to spend to run a shuttle service, 5 days a week from 5 a.m. to probably 10 p.m. That gets expensive. Okay.
Olaf, I know that you have another commitment that you need to get to. Just wanted to thank you on behalf of myself and Blair for your participation in the webinar today. And I say, folks, you'll have a chance to see the recorded webinar, and you can certainly look Olaf up and ask him any questions that you might need to in the future.
Thank you.
We got just one. Yeah, thank you. One or two more questions. Let's see here. I'm scrolling. This might be for Blair and Mary Kate. Are there any plans for NCDOT to create parking spaces exclusively for ride sharing and or park and ride facilities in Raleigh?
I would think for the Raleigh part, that would be more up to the city or Go Raleigh. I don't know that NCDOT would have a part in that.
Mary Kate, are you aware of any plans?
I'm not aware of any plans for park and rides specifically for shared ride services, but I know that in our internal discussions about how we implement this program successfully, we've started talking with our real estate operations and CapDev teams to make sure that we have adequate space set aside for the staging of Uber and Lyft vehicles and for pickup and drop off areas, just to avoid conflicts with buses coming in and out, pedestrians, things like that. So that is something that we consider as we anticipate the rollout.
Yeah, and I would just add on that, that's really great that you're planning that way. And I do think it's important in terms of making these services work successfully. It's about the street and also the parking and how to stage all of these services, just like bike sharing, required, and scooter sharing. I mean, they all need designated spaces, and to the extent that there's really good signage and clear places, it makes it easier to manage and operate.
Let me throw in the very last question, and maybe this is kind of for Sharon, but Mary Kate, appreciate your insights too. Where do you think that public transportation has kind of let people down that would give these TNCs part of the mode share and part of the market?
Well, I think that, that public transit has not always been supported at the level it needs. And it also hasn't, the frequency of service is an area where it hasn't kept up. You know, a lot of smaller systems especially, and there's pretty big gaps, and there are times when there is no service. So that's a problem from the transit side. And then I think as jobs and land use has changed, the systems have not always kept up with that as well. So a number of cities over the last year in particular, you know, have started to do these remakes of their bus service and really thinking through, you know, where the jobs are, where the people are, and trying to increase frequency. And there's, you know, there's some planners out there who talk about frequency versus coverage, and, you know, the idea that the places that if you have to have that trade-off, like having frequent enough service is going to build your demand, and then ultimately it may help you expand your service area. So it's a balancing act because, of course, fairness and coverage is important as well. But I think those are the areas, you know, the fact that you can push a button on your phone and your ride shows up and it takes you to exactly where you want to go, is, you know, that's hard to compete with except on price.
Yeah. So Mary Kate, I'll let you have the last word.
Okay, thanks. So I agree. I agree with all that. I think that frequency is that's huge. I mean, that's convenience, that's time that you're not, that's money. Time is money. You're not spending there waiting for the bus. I will say though, I think that it doesn't always work. These partnerships, sometimes it's not a transit partnership. Sometimes it is just people want to use Uber in a certain area. I think where these partnerships will be seen successful are in constrained zones where there is ridership, but the productivity will just never, it'll just never be that high. And, you know, smaller vehicles, Uber and Lyft, they can support that level of passengers per hour, you know, 4 to 6 passengers per hour, much more efficiently than a 40-foot bus or even a, you know, a paratransit-sized vehicle. It's just they're going to be more successful at it. So why not save your resources as the transit agency, help subsidize those trips to make sure that folks are still able to be mobile in that area, and then improve your service network elsewhere, you know, increase the frequency where it matters. And then, you know, it's just finding a better way to provide coverage service is the way I see it.
Yeah. Yeah. And just sort of adding to that, I think that, you know, ultimately, like, transit is the backbone of making a complete system work. And I think in some ways, what the TNCs have done for transit is it's kind of provided a wake-up call, perhaps, on, you know, we really need to take advantage of the latest technology, marketing, flexibility that is possible within transit agencies. And so it can improve transit, you know, all of those things can make transit service more desirable and usable. And so, you know, there's a plus side to that too.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you all very much. Great conversation and information there. We appreciate everyone that joined in with us. There on the last slide there, you can see the links to the prior webinars. This one will be up probably within a week. You'll get an email from Blair on that. You also have our next scheduled date is July 9th. And as I mentioned, if you have a topic that you want covered, let Blair or I know, and we will let you know about that July 9th webinar or whether we take a break for the summer and to be able to put some things together. So again, thank you all very much, and we appreciate you joining in.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.